Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today for the social media launch of a new report by Human Rights Watch titled Living in Fear and Humiliation: Rising Xenophobic Harassment and Violence Towards Central Asian Migrants in Russia. I'm Tanya Lokshina, Europe and Central Asia Associate Director at Human Rights Watch, and I'm very honored to be moderating this discussion. Now, the publication of Human Rights Watch's report almost coincides with the first anniversary of the horrid attack allegedly orchestrated by ISIS on Crocus City Hall, a large entertainment venue in the outskirts of Moscow. On March 22, 2024, a group of gunmen attacked Crocus City Hall during a heavily attended concert, killing at least 144 people and injuring 551 persons. Russian authorities swiftly detained four citizens of Tajikistan as the main suspects, and at least 23 others, mostly of Central Asian origin, suspected of connections with the gunmen. Russian law enforcement brutally tortured at least two of the main suspects, with Russian federal television broadcasting recordings of the torture, which was quite unprecedented, actually, and emblematic of the tolerance for violence among Russian authorities and Russian society. The suspects have yet to face trial. In the aftermath of the attack, there has been a sharp escalation in abuses against migrants, specifically Central Asian migrants, mostly from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. They've been facing ethnic profiling, arbitrary arrests, and harassment by Russian police and private actors, including far nationalist groups. Migrants have also become subject to new, often abusive administrative restrictions, and in their public rhetoric, Russian officials literally double down, fanning racist and anti migrant public sentiments. As the anniversary of the Crocus City Hall attack is approaching, our hearts go out to the victims and their families. But the heinous massacre cannot possibly justify massive rights abuses against Central Asian migrants in Russia. Without further ado, I will introduce our speakers. First, Syinat Sultanalieva, Human Rights Watch's Europe and Central Asia researcher and author of this new report. She is joined by two guest experts, Alexander Verkhovsky, director of the Moscow-based SOVA Research Center and a leading specialist on Russian ultranationalists, and Yan Matusevich, a journalist and researcher on migration issues who used to work from Central Asia and is now based in Germany. Now, the platform which we are using does not allow the audience to pop up with questions. However, if you have questions for our experts, please type them up in the messages from audience chat box on the right hand side of your screen. Thank you so much. Syinat, you now have the floor.
Thanks, Tanya. So I'll just give you sort of a brief overview of the report. I invite everyone, of course, to go and read it in full. It has testimony from about 20 migrants that I was able to interview, mostly those who have left Russia. I think there are 7 who are still working in Russia, but most of them have already left Russia at the time of the interviews. And then I've also spoken with 24 experts, researchers, and lawyers, 2 of whom have kindly agreed to join us in the discussion today. So just like, again, also a very brief summary of the report and the findings that we have presented in it, starting with an overview of anti-migrant legislative initiatives since the Crocus City Hall attack in Russia, then abuses linked to war, Russia's war in Ukraine, physical violence by xenophobic and vigilante groups against Central Asian migrants, and sort of, and to finish it off with administrative harassment, mostly by police against Central Asian migrants. As Tanya may have mentioned Central Asian migrants have long since been subjected to arbitrary application of complicated administrative regulations and migration laws in Russia, with smallest infractions often leading to their expulsion and deportation. But this situation has worsened significantly following the Crocus City Hall attack last year in March. And since then, we've seen several legislative initiatives that have come through, which restrict and limit rights of labor migrants in Russia, who already have been experiencing quite a lot of discrimination, harassment, xenophobic also, including expulsion regime, regional bans on employment, proof of Russian language proficiency for school enrollment of children of migrants, etc. So very briefly, one of the biggest, I guess, innovations or conceptually new developments in Russian legislative sphere is the introduction of a new expulsion regime, which I understand, of course, it's not maybe new globally, but in Russia, that's sort of a new way that they're putting it. And it's an expulsion regime for foreigners who find themselves on a special registry of controlled persons. The law enforcement will be able to, without judicial oversight, have the power to designate a migrant a controlled person and add them to the new registry. As one of my respondents actually has said, that this development creates a lot of risks for corruption, because police will be able to just simply invent an offense, and that's it. A migrant would be put into the register of controlled persons and thus subject to an expulsion. And of course, that allows police to say, if you don't give me 20,000 rubles, I will deport you by, adding you into the registry of controlled persons. I mean, that's a very, of course, hypothetical situation, although we don't know, maybe this might happen, maybe this has already been happening as we speak. The foreigners may find themselves designated a controlled person and added to this registry because their temporary residence may have ended, expired, maybe their work permit or patente, maybe their employment contract had expired, or some other, or maybe there was an enforced reduction of the period of temporary stay. So those are sort of like legitimate reasons. But then, as we've mentioned, also regular police officers will be able to just, decide to put a migrant on this registry. The law also grants law enforcement agencies the power to use surveillance technologies, including geolocation and facial recognition. Apropos of that, there's, I think, actually an underway initiative in St. Petersburg, if I'm not mistaken, about somehow instructing street cameras, CCTV cameras, to be able to recognize people by their ethnic, appearance, I guess, and the plan is to put it into places of compact residence. I don't know how it is in English, but компактное проживание мигрантов, so places where migrants usually work or live together, supposedly with an aim, of course, security reasons. The law will exclude a controlled person from being able to lawfully marry in Russia, imposes restrictions on them with respect to opening bank accounts, transferring money, carrying out other financial transactions, registering as individual entrepreneurs, establishing legal entities, and just doing any kind of entrepreneurial or, I guess, financial work in Russia. And since taking effect in February 25, these changes have already prevented hundreds of legal migrants, possibly thousands at this point, because we're in already end of March, from accessing their bank accounts due to technical issues with the registry system. And then there was also another report by Memorial colleagues, I think, who were saying that many of the people who found themselves on this registry in the database are legally residing migrants or foreigners in Russia, whereas those whose exactly their permit may have expired or they're in the process of renewing it, those are the ones who didn't actually find themselves in this registry. So there is, of course, issues or questions towards the technical perfection of the system, or rather imperfection of it at this point. Then also in November 24 last year, the State Duma has adopted a new law which prohibits public schools from enrolling children of foreign nationals without proof of Russian language proficiency. And that's also sort of, we could say, is a way of weaponizing language proficiency as an exclusionary mechanism here, as a, with the system being designed to deny migrant children access to education and to lifelong and intergenerational economic and health benefits that education provides. As well as protection from hazardous child labor and early marriage and other possibilities that might happen to children who don't have access to education. And then finally, we have sort of 12 regions of Russia have banned, could have been maybe more at this point as well, who have banned or enacted restrictions on migration in their own regions, meaning employment bans basically. And migrants would be prohibited from working from in a wide range of employment spheres, medical spheres as doctors and nurses and pharmacists, in education, in transportation, public transportation, in trade, in office work, and other areas like that. So those are sort of like just an overview of the legislative changes that the Russian authorities have enacted since Krakow City Hall. Then just very quickly going over into the abuses linked to war in Ukraine. Experts that I've talked to and also migrants that I've talked to have talked about deportations as threats being used as tactic in mobilization of Central Asian migrants in Russia, and also the military drive being extended through or to prisons and immigration detention centers. I think of maybe note here is that in August 24, even though previously Russian government sort of allowed for a fast track naturalization process for foreigners who serve in Russian army, in August 24, the authorities have, President Putin had signed a law which allows removals of citizenship from naturalized citizens for failure to register for military service. And of course, that's problematic, considering if, of course, it's being applied only to naturalized citizens of specific ethnic origin, which we cannot say is happening at this point or not, but we cannot deny that there is, of course, a danger or risk of that happening. We've been, again, as I've mentioned, told of examples of Russian authorities using blackmailing basically migrants with detention and threat of deportation. So, for example, a lawyer that I talked to has described, so we should say that police would detain migrants, whether it's in a raid on illegal migration or some other way, and tell them, well, you've been working here for so many years, shame on you, protect us, give back to the country that has fed you for so long. And there's this whole rhetoric of course, Russia being a money cow and migrants sort of coming in and suckling on it and taking all the money away without really giving back to the country. And that's sort of like the rhetoric that's really driving this, driving forward, calls both for mobilization of naturalized citizens more than say just non-naturalized Russian citizens, and then as well as to just somehow well, not for they wouldn't say the word force, I guess, but really to motivate migrants to go and register for voluntary service in the Russian army. Migrants were told that also they've told us about cases of deception when being recruited. So they would be told that they would be working on building restoration or construction, for example, but they would actually find themselves on the front line or in the near vicinity of the front line, digging trenches, collecting corpses, just completely horrified of the situation where they find themselves, right? The military recruitment has also, as I've mentioned, has extended to immigration detention centers, and we have a whole section on that. And one of the most, I guess, infamous of these detention centers is the Sakharova detention center, and the conditions there have been described as inhumane and degrading to the personal dignity of migrants being held there, but then also as a place where Russian authorities, defense ministry authorities, recruiters are able to come and just sort of recruit en masse. Physical violence has also, we've been told of stories, not as much, unfortunately. I mean, that's an interesting, I guess, question in itself, why the migrants that I've talked with wouldn't really talk about it as much, but I mean, many psychological reasons, I guess. But we've had access to a database by the Nazi Video Monitoring Project. It's an independent research organization that monitors xenophobic violence in Russia. And according to them, there has been a notable increase in documented attacks against Central Asian migrants in Russia from basically late 2022. But then there has also been a spike after the Crocus City Hall attack. We've had access to this database. It has over 1,400 videos of hate-motivated physical attacks downloaded from various Telegram channels, which are maintained by xenophobic and neo-Nazi groups. And we have been able to identify 426 of them as being tagged as Central Asian or migrants or construction workers or something like that. And out of these 426, we've selected 17 videos for detailed analysis and have been able to sort of like analyze the type of attacks that would usually take place. And they would, range from coordinated physical attacks to targeted property damage. Physical attacks would often start with use of pepper sprays, for example, followed by group assault. A lot of the times there were, of course, group assaults against the targets. And also the targets, the victims of these attacks were mostly adult males working in construction, maintenance, service sectors, which are usually associated with migrant labor in Russia. Group attacks of up to 10 people. There was also an interesting point that there was these groups would often employ entrapment as a method of luring men into set up dates with women or girls, and sometimes men or boys. And in some cases, the attackers in the video description would say that the bait was under 18 years of age. And this is basically, a common tactic of xenophobic far-right groups to paint migrants as rapists and pedophiles. And that's unfortunately not the case only in Russia. It's basically everywhere where we have xenophobic violence. Videos also show destruction of property, as I've mentioned. And one important moment here, I think, is that many perpetrators, pretty much majority of the videos that have been posted, seem to be by the same sort of groups of people who seem to be systematically documenting their attacks with the goal of recording them and distributing them later via social media, mainly through Telegram channels. Descriptive text accompanying the videos suggests an element of propaganda to their actions. For example, trumpeting the victim's ethnicity, claiming that this is a Tajik that they caught, or like teaching the rules of being in Russia or working in Russia, whatever, appealing to Russian national pride, and possibly with an aim of recruiting more members from within sympathetic audiences to inciting more xenophobic violence in that sense. And we also talk about in the report about vigilante activism, increased vigilante activism. I'm not really going to stop on that right now, but an important point here, maybe Alexander can talk about it a little bit on this more, that there seems to be, especially in the recent few years, that there's sort of a move towards, or maybe not so much collaboration, but definitely a lot more tolerance on the part of authorities towards these vigilante groups, which oftentimes are seen collaborate or like being present at least during the anti-migrant raids by police authorities and others. And just to finish it off, administrative harassment against Central Asian migrants against the existing migration system in Russia is increasingly punitive. It penalizes even minor administrative infractions, and police enforcers are its main enforcers. Police officers are its main enforcers here, and a lot of the migrants that I talked with have shared their personal experiences of just being, arbitrarily detained, suggesting, of course, ethnic profiling on the part of police on the streets of Moscow, St. Petersburg, Ekaterinburg, Samara, whichever city you would take. And the newest, I guess, form of this kind of harassment we've seen following the Crocus City Hall attack is the border sort of harassment at the border, basically, where extra checks on incoming Central Asians massive detentions for several days, where migrants would be kept in detention places in the airports without access to food, to adequate water, sanitation, and other issues. And also, they have adopted further invasive practices, which is new, it seems, and related to the Crocus City Hall attack, or potentially just general sort of like the worsened treatment of Central Asian migrants. And these practices are searching phones and other belongings of migrants during random stops and checks, or at the border crossing points, where they would be able to just, take the mobile phone of a person and just go through it. And if there is anything suggesting that, an incoming migrant has sympathizes with Ukraine, for example, right, or has watched or viewed some kind of stories, whatever, has any kind of photographs on the phone that suggest that they might not agree with the Russian sort of official line on many of the issues that are divisive right now in Russia, that alone already serves as reason for not allowing entrance of the migrants, or if they have been stopped while they're already in Russia, that could be reason enough to really send them out, or to expel them from Russia. I'll just finish off. I mean, this is probably, again, as I mentioned many times already, that this is not specific to Russia, unfortunately, but that also happens in Russia. And it's worth mentioning that when dealing with the state, migrants from Central Asia often have to bear the burden of proof when dealing with authorities. So, for example, even those who have received Russian citizenship and do not have a phenotypically Russian appearance, report having their citizenship questioned by public officials who would say that, oh, you probably just bought these documents, or maybe they're just fake, basically, right? And just sort of like allowing for the space of doubt that even, having a citizenship really won't protect you from xenophobic, really, violence and harassment by police or state actors in general. I'll stop here, and I think I went a little bit overboard. I'm really sorry about that.
Thank you so much, Syinat. Alexander, one of the areas that the report touches upon is xenophobic violence, specifically violence perpetrated by ultra-nationalist groups, also the activities of vigilante groups. And in this respect, I'm just curious about your view on the situation. And in particular, it really seemed that at some point in the near past, Russian authorities pretty much stifled ultra-nationalists. And suddenly they're all popping up like left, front, and center and attacking migrants. So, where did they come from? What is the relationship between ultra-nationalists and what Syinat described as vigilante groups? And most importantly, what does the government do about it, if anything?
I'll try to answer. First, I have to say that I have to say it as a director of SOVA Research Center that the center is enlisted as foreign agent, and I'm obliged to say so. I'm sorry about my English, but what we have. Answering this question, I have to say that yes, we have a long story of discrimination and on violence related to migrants and to ethnic minorities. I mean, in ethnic minorities, but all these things, they slowly went down in previous decade. But starting from 2021, not from the beginning of the war, not from Crocus City Hall, but from year 2021, these problems, let's say, started to reappear. I'm not sure why has it happened, but in 2021, we had a massive anti-migrant campaign in mass media supported by many high-profile, high-position officials. And those nationalist vigilante groups, which are mentioned in the report, some of them appeared this year, some of them, let's say, started to be really more active this year. I mean, that year, 2021. And since then, they grew and grew more and more. Our center write about them twice a year in some special reports. But if we turn to violent hate crimes on the streets, they started to grow much later, since the beginning of 2023. Yes, in the report, there are this Nazi video monitoring project, and its data is mentioned. Yes, we collaborate with this group. It's really very productive, and thanks to them, we know much more about hate crimes. But we have to underline that hate crimes may be committed not only by neo-Nazi, but by other people also are capable of. But yes, we see a lot of teenager groups which revive the traditions of Nazi skinheads of 20 years ago. And our center counts only serious attacks, not just gas spray or something, but serious beating. People are wounded. Thanks God, mostly not killed. And I can just mention numbers to make an impression what we really have. In 2021, before the war, we had 73 victims. SOVA Center knew, of course there are more, but we have no official statistics, so we have to address only to SOVA Center data. 73 victims, and among them, not less than 36 were victims because of this, let's say, non-Slavic appearance, I would call that. Next year, in 2022, it was a very visible decline. So respectively, there were 32 and 11. But next year, 2023, it was already 123 and 66. Last year, it was 262 and 161. Even from the beginning of this year, we have already 70 victims total, and 39 at least of them suffered because they were looked, let's say, non-Slavic. Mostly they were migrants, but maybe not all of them. Never previously we witnessed such quick growth of hate crimes. Now we're returning to the period, let's say, 15 years ago, and the share of migrants is growing too among those victims. Yes, authorities are also worrying about this brutal violence. They try to suppress this wave of hate crimes. We counted in 2023, let's say, 33 people arrested for that, not counting those who were arrested in Makhachkala airport. And last year, there were already 67, so twice more. So yes, authorities pay attention, but it's really difficult to stop this wave. You also may see some details on our recent report on hate crimes. But there is another layer of Russian nationalism, more visible, those vigilante groups. They are not hidden, they are not an underground. They advertise themselves. There are many organizations, and there are, let's say, three types of actions they do. First, it's they interfere to some private conflicts, maybe even in school, and it doesn't matter where one side they see it as ethnic Russian and another side migrant. And then they propagate what they did, how they put some pressure and so on and so forth. The second form is those raids in the places where migrants live or work. Let's say last recent February, we counted only for two main organizations 54 such raids. 15 of them were committed together with police. And in 42 of them, police was called, but in the very end, when everything, let's say, was already done. And those vigilante groups, they do not have any official status of, police helpers or whatever it is. They collaborate with police just as citizens. And police sometimes prefer to work with them, sometimes try to avoid. It depends in most of cases on some personal attitude. And the third sphere of activity is writing a lot of complaints to authorities against migrants or any other supposed enemies. this movement is big enough and very quickly growing. It's not only about those organizations which are mentioned in the report, but we have to say that Ruskaya Общina, the Russian community, last year obviously overgrew all others, let's say, taken together. Now it's the main such organization. But it's not only about activity from below. We have also this continuing anti-migrant policy from above. And I would repeat, it started in 2021, but of course accelerated during last, let's say, 2 years at least, maybe 2.5. It's a big topic. There are a lot of examples in the report. And the most impressive example for me personally are these amendments to the law of education, which forbid education for children and adults who do not have good Russian skills or are not registered. That's, let's say, a bad decision for all, for them and for local population, for the state, I think also. That's purely bad decision. And maybe it's the first time when authorities so literally took and implemented the measure which was suggested by radical nationalists. So I think it's a pure example of right populism. And the last thing I would mention, that when this law was suggested to State Duma on the first hearing, the infamous Duma member Andrei Lugovoy, who presented the law, he mostly told Duma members not about the education, but about migration as a threat to Russian identity. And his idea was that this organized invasion of migrants is a part of some specific project of United States and Great Britain with the purpose to undermine Russian stability. And the problem is it's not only him who thinks this way, and that makes it really dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander. And I could not agree more about that particular piece of legislation. Not only it's discriminatory and totally contrary Russia's human rights obligations, but also on a very pragmatic level, it just clashes with the official rhetoric about how migrants have to adapt in Russian society, how they have to know Russian language, as in, if there is no way they can learn it, how they expected to learn it. Yan, I'm giving the floor to you, and I'm very grateful that you agreed to talk about a very specific aspect of the problem, that is forced or coerced mobilization of migrants and newly nationalized citizens, including from Central Asia. That issue has been particularly aggravating based on a range of news reports, and I'm just wondering what your research has evidenced so far.
Well, thank you for that question. I mean, it's a really difficult topic to research because, as Syinat mentioned, I think it's one of the aspects of mobilization in Russia that is the most shrouded in secrecy. I think we actually potentially know more about recruitment in prisons than we do about recruitment among migrants. But generally speaking, I think there are sort of two different tactics at play. So one, which was already mentioned, is this whole kind of cat and mouse game with naturalization. So on the one hand, naturalization has been sort of simplified for those who join the military. So it's provided as sort of a reward for someone to sign up for a contract. But then also now with new legislation from last year, they can also revoke your citizenship for refusing to register with a local draft board. So what we've seen, and this is ongoing, I just recently was looking into a case from just a few weeks ago in St. Petersburg where you had police raiding markets and actually specifically looking for Russian citizens who of an immigrant background. So that was their purpose, and which is interesting because before, they would be looking for people who didn't have papers or who had some sort of irregular status, but now they're actually actively looking people who have all their papers in order. And now what they do is that they look, so on the one hand, they look for people who recently naturalized, and then look if they've registered with, if they're male, if they've registered with the local draft board, and if they haven't, they've basically been blackmailing people by saying, well, we can take away your citizenship and deport you, or force you to sign a contract. So that's one tactic that's been used, and we've seen that actually in response to that, there's been a drop in naturalization rates. I don't have the latest statistics for 24, but we already saw it in 23 for all countries except Tajikistan. Tajikistan is kind of a special case because the economic situation there is so bad at the moment that people are still, the rate of migration to Russia is actually increasing. But for Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, we've seen really naturalization has dropped off, and also from speaking to people, and I'm sure Syinat had a similar experience as part of this report, people who were applying for citizenship suddenly have stopped doing so or have stopped the procedure. So that's one way that people are being forced into the military. Another way is also the immigration detention centers, which it's important to note that the conditions there are often worse than in Russian prisons. Many people have been in these detention centers for months, if not years, sort of stuck in limbo, not deported. And these people, I mean, you could argue that it's a form of torture, and they've been offered contracts for the military as a way out. Another thing is that there's been a tactic, obviously, of deception. So there have been a lot of jobs that are advertised with security companies or sort of middlemen, where, for example, people are told that they'll be doing gardening work, or they're going to be doing construction, or working in a cafeteria, but it turns out that they're going to be on the front lines. Now, some of these people end up actually in the military with weapons in their hands. Others end up doing quote unquote support work. So they're driving trucks and kind of in the military logistics, but it's also equally, I mean, first of all, illegal, but also dangerous, right? These are people who are put in very dangerous situations. And I think, and we've seen that since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and it's ongoing. Another tactic that's been used, that again, it's really hard to have any hard data on this, but there are several cases that are confirmed where people who came in to apply for work permits, they have to now, the new laws require you to sign up for health insurance and go through all these medical tests. So there's a lot of paperwork that you need to fill out. And there have been cases of people unwittingly signing military service contracts as the paper being slipped in as one of the papers that they have to sign. And if they're not, very fluent in Russian, or I've even heard that some of this is written in like tiny fonts, so you can't really see what you're reading through. And so that some people have been recruited through that. So these are kind of the tactics that are commonly used. We're also seeing cases of people. So the new, I think the interesting thing to kind of look at will be how this register of controlled persons will be used for mobilization. We don't know, I think, at this point, but we do have information, right, that I think 700,000 people as of a few weeks ago. It's just come into force, I think, late February. So we have 700,000 foreign citizens who are on this list of controlled persons. And as Syinat mentioned, they can no longer make banking transactions. They're not allowed to drive a car. They can be under surveillance. Police are allowed to search their premises and so on. And so for me, it seems quite obvious, and we'll kind of have to see in the next coming weeks and months, that these people will also come under pressure to somehow join the military effort. And I think these things are also interlinked. So yeah, I mean, it's almost a bit contradictory, the Russian policies, because on the one hand, they're also increasing deportations. So they're also deporting people at levels that we haven't seen in a long time. At the same time, there's a huge labor deficit. At the same time, they need people in the military. So it's kind of, they're going in all different directions. But I think the general thrust of it is to really turn specifically Central Asian migrants into permanent second-class citizens, regardless of citizenship, regardless of what paperwork they have. I mean, specifically with this controlled person status, I mean, you're basically putting people in a liminal state of constant deportability. So I think that seems to be the connecting line that goes through all of this.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yan. And now I went through the social media feed, and we've got a bunch of questions that can be essentially summed up in a very straightforward manner, even though they're phrased differently. What can be done? What should be done about this plethora of problems? And which particular actors should be taking specific steps to remedy the wrong? And in this respect, I'm going to first ask Syinat to summarize the recommendations detailed in the report, the recommendations which are in fact addressed to different international actors. And then I'm going to turn to our experts and ask them whether we are possibly missing something, whether there are any specific recommendations that they would make to Russian authorities or to other authorities and actors in their respective areas of expertise. Syinat.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. So we have a bunch of recommendations for different actors. And of course, the majority of recommendations are towards Russian authorities. And there is legitimate concern, of course, right, that Russia will, if Russia will even listen to this or act on any of those recommendations. But probably the biggest recommendation there is for Russian authorities to adopt and enforce a zero tolerance policy for anti-migrant hate speech, including also by public officials, by members of the parliament and others, to effectively address xenophobic violence experienced by migrants. And that's something I think we may have touched upon a little bit, but the problem that we mentioned in the report is that even though Russia does not have specifically hate-motivated violence-related legislation, I think, but there is sort of some legislation that can be used to address xenophobic violence. However, most of such cases are prosecuted under hooliganism or some other sort of minor acts that do not cause harm or something like that. So that's also a big part of why it looks like Russian authorities aren't really doing anything about the rise of xenophobic violence in Russia. And that's something that really needs to be done, right? And also the biggest thing would be to retract abusive legislation that we talked about today, the registry, the expulsion regime, the requirement for Russian proficiency for children, before enrolling into schools. So that's for Russia. Then we're also, of course, there's a stake for Central Asian governments and something for them to do as well. And among the recommendations that we have for Central Asian governments is for them to build on existing consular programs to support migrant workers in Russia. And unfortunately, in some of the discussions with migrants, I've heard that, of course, there is consular support, hotlines or something like that. But unfortunately, they're just really understaffed. And there's just not much that these consular workers can really do to help on a massive scale. So that's something that Central Asian governments should really build upon and expand and really strengthen to support their workers in Russia. And to also for Central Asian governments to treat this issue as a core part of their bilateral relations with Moscow, including by also on their own urging zero tolerance of xenophobic violence and anti-migrant hate speech by Russian authorities, or and one other thing is to probably also to create joint initiatives with their Russian counterparts to protect migrants' rights in various areas. And we also, of course, address the United Nations and other international organizations to support both Russia and Central Asian governments in sort of addressing this jointly and constructively as much as possible. I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Syinat. And there was a specific question about the threat of statelessness in connection with newly naturalized Russian citizens of Central Asian origin, especially those who are being threatened with having their citizenship stripped off. I can answer this question myself in the interest of time. Yes, I mean, clearly the threat is very much there, because we are talking about people in particular who gave up their citizenship when they became Russian nationals, and non-Russian authorities are known for having stripped people of Russian citizenship, claiming that when applying for the citizenship, those people supposedly provided incorrect information. There have been numerous cases of that sort, including in the area of terrorism and counter-terrorism in particular. So yes, that's a very good question, and the threat is very much there. Alexander, are we missing something?
Maybe you do missing. I would add maybe 3 points. First, regarding hate crimes legislation. We have such legislation, and we have even enforcement. What's going on? But the problem is that the system sometimes isn't working properly. We need to adjust it. Maybe it's not easy to say it in few words, but yes, there are some recommendations here. The second big thing is the complex anti-discriminatory legislation. There were numerous cases when different international bodies, including UN bodies, recommended to Russian Federation to adopt such legislation and to implement it. And usually Russian authorities answered that there are anti-discriminatory norms in every law. But that's not enough. That's not what a complex anti-discriminatory legislation is. So that's an important thing. And as to the zero tolerance to hate speech, we have a law on hate speech. We have even many, and maybe even too many. So what we have a deficit of is a lack of responsibility of bureaucrats for what they say, because it's in most cases it's not a thing which can be or have to be criminally punished. It's a civil service law, has to include some norms which include punishment of non-criminal nature, and lack of promotion or whatever, what is really important for a person in the state machine. If he or she says something racist, which happens from time to time, if there is a risk of such serious losses, I'm sure they will speak much more politely about these things.
Thank you, Alexander. The point about accountability for civil servants is particularly important. And yes, indeed, disciplinary measures are called for and could be very effective in that context. Yan, any recommendations from your side? How do we remedy the wrongs?
I mean, that's a tough one considering we're dealing with Russia. But I would, I agree with what Syinat mentioned. I think that Central Asian governments have a really big role to play. I think it's understandable to some extent, but I think it would be useful to have for central governments to really push for more transparency, because there's just such a lack of information, right? These are, at the end of the day, they're citizens, and it's such a taboo topic that even when I'm doing my research, government officials in Central Asia don't want to talk about it on the record, right? And then when you talk with them off the record, they'll say, "Well, you know why?" And we're afraid of facing some sort of repercussions. And so I think it would at least be helpful to have some sort of, I mean, I'm not even talking about accountability at this point, but just transparent, just data, just so at least we know what's going on. I mean, there have been people who have been basically sent back to Kyrgyzstan, and then or other places in Central Asia, and then there's no more access to them, or even people who have unfortunately been killed in the fighting in Ukraine, right? All of that information is completely secretive. So if we could at least have some sort of public discussion or information about that, I think that would already be an important first step.
Thank you so much, Yan. And thank you to all of the speakers and to the audience who found the time to join us. For those who wanted to attend but did not have the time, the event was recorded, and the recording is going to be shared on Human Rights Watch's social media channels, including Facebook, YouTube, and others. Thanks a lot, everyone. A really fascinating discussion and a great report, if I may say so. Please read it. It's very important. And congratulations, Syinat. Good job.
Thanks.